During the pre-dreadnought era, France, along with Britain and Russia, was one of the major leaders in the design and construction of battleships. However, the beginning of the 20th century would begin to work against France and Russia. Of course, Russia went to war with Japan in 1904 and 5 and lost a fair amount of its capital ships, which set it back on the power scale dramatically. France, in 1901, laid down the first of the two Republic-class battleships, and then in 1903, they laid down the first of the 4 Liberty-class battleships. In 1905, Britain would lay down the keel plates to what would become HMS Dreadnought, and in 1906, the United States would lay down the keel plates to what would become the USS South Carolina. Meanwhile, France was still designing pre-dreadnoughts, and they were actually working on a ship that was an improved version of the Liberty. In February 1906, when Dreadnought was launched, the first keel plate to the Danton was laid down, which was the first of 6 ships. 3 more of these ships would be laid down in 1907, and the last 2 were laid down in 1908. The Dantons would not enter service until 1911, and by then, the Royal Navy had constructed 10 battleships, 5 battlecruisers, and were laying down a series of ships to their new upgunned 13.5-inch super dreadnoughts. The United States, which was replacing France on the power scale, had 6 dreadnoughts of its own in service and was laying down 4 more, with 2 of those being the New York and Texas, which would end up mounting 14-inch guns. Germany, which had now found itself in second place on the power scale, had 8 battleships in service, 1 battlecruiser, 5 battleships under construction, and 3 battlecruisers under construction. To make France's position worse, none of those nations showed any signs of slowing their building programs down, and France did not have a single dreadnought or battlecruiser in service. As the 6 Danton-class battleships were nearing completion, France knew it needed to start working on dreadnoughts, and they would lay down the first keel plates to Courbet and Jean Bart in late 1910, and then 2 more would follow up, the Paris and France, in 1911. By the time the Courbet class was laid down, France recognized that it was behind the game in dreadnought development. The Courbets had wing turrets at a time frame when the centerline arrangement was taking hold in every other major navy, and the gun caliber of the Courbets was 12 inches, which, as already mentioned, Britain and the United States were upgunning to 13.5 and 14 inches, and Japan had ordered the Congo, which would also mount 14-inch guns. The only major naval power that France's gun caliber was on par with was Germany's, but the German 12-inch guns were superior in stats. Due to these issues, the Marine Nationale began working on their own series of super dreadnoughts, and in 1912 they would lay down the 3 keels to the Bretagne-class battleships, Bretagne, Lorraine, and Provence. The Bretagnes were effectively the Courbet's hull, except now they had a centerline main battery arrangement with 5 dual 13.4-inch turrets. Unfortunately, with Bretagne effectively being an improved Courbet, both classes had a series of integral issues in their designs, which would hinder them in any battle situation. All of the issues related to the thinking of the Marine Nationale at the time. They did not believe battle ranges would exceed 8,000 meters, and on average they expected the battle range to decrease to around 6,000 meters. As a result, both classes of battleship could only elevate their main guns to 12 degrees, which gave the 12-inch guns of the Courbet class a maximum range of 13,500 meters, and the 13.4-inch guns of the Bretagnes a maximum range of 14,500 meters. As designed, both classes of battleship would have a main rangefinder with a base length of 9 feet, and it would be mounted on top of the conning tower, which was literally 1 level higher than the superfiring No. 2 turret. The turrets themselves would each be equipped with a single 5-foot base length rangefinder for local fire control. Unfortunately, the small base length and the relatively low position of all of these rangefinders meant that the Bretagnes could not see targets at very long distances. This in turn meant that the Bretagnes and Courbets were unable to fire at long range accurately. The final major issue with the designs of the Courbet and Bretagnes in relation to the short estimated battle ranges was their armor schemes. Their armor schemes were derived directly from the pre-dreadnought era, which meant most of the armor was distributed and focused on vertical surfaces in order to stop shells flying at flat trajectories. There was almost no deck armor. The so-called armor that was placed on the decks was not there to stop shells that plunged down onto the decks, but rather to stop splinters from shells that struck the vertical armor. Regardless of the issues surrounding the Corbeil and Bretagne classes, which France at this time was going to ignore, on the 30th of March 1912, a new naval building program was authorized within France that would expand the Navy dramatically. The 1912 building program would ensure that by 1920, France had no less than 28 seagoing battleships, 10 cruisers, and 52 destroyers. Now I'm sure some of you are looking at the number of 28 battleships and wondering how a nation that didn't even start building its first dreadnought until 4 years after dreadnought entered service, how they ever intended to build 28 within an 8-year time frame. The answer is they didn't intend to build 28 new battleships. They were going to have a mismatched fleet of old battleships and new battleships, going back to the 2 Republic-class battleships, 3 of the 4 Liberty-class battleships, since Liberty itself exploded and sank in September of 1911, the 6 Danton-class battleships, the 4 Corbeil-class battleships, and the 3 Bretagne-class battleships. Though the design process of the Bretagnes began before 1912, since the construction did not start until 1912, they would be counted as new battleships in the program. This meant that France needed to design at least 3 new classes of battleships within the upcoming 5 years. The design for the next class needed to be finished by the end of 1912, as the class would have its first 2 ships laid down in 1913, followed up by 2 more in 1914, and then the second class would have 4 ships laid down in 1915, and the third and final class would have 2 ships laid down in 1917. A few months after this plan was approved, it would be altered due to deteriorating international relations, and it would see that 4 ships would be laid down in 1913, followed by 1 in 1914, and a final 4 in 1915. It was intended that as the designs got newer, the ships would become more powerful. However, France's shipyards could not contain large ships, so they had to come up with new design techniques in order to keep the ship compact while getting as much power out of it as possible. Of course, the first thing France considered was increasing their gun calibers to 15 inches so they could have a larger caliber but less guns, which meant a smaller ship. It was quickly recognized that France would not have a 15-inch gun ready in time for any of the building years. It became clear that the French would have to rely on the 13.4-inch gun for the remainder of their new battleship designs, but they had to increase the number of guns present in order to increase the power output of the ship. In order to place an increased number of guns on a ship similar in size to the Bretagnes, they developed the quadruple turret. For the first 5 ships to be laid down in 1913 and 14, those vessels, which would go on to become the Normandy class, would only have 3 quadruple turrets, giving them a total of 12 guns, and the turrets were spaced out along the center line of the ship in order to prevent 2 turrets from being knocked out by a single hit. The final design, which became known as the Lyon class, with the 4 ships intended to be laid down in 1915, would have 4 quadruple turrets, giving it a total of 16 main battery guns. Even though the ships were designed to be as compact as possible, their sizes inevitably increased, especially for the Lyons, which maxed out at 195 meters in overall length, which was nearly 40 meters greater than that of the Bretagne. At the time the 1912 program was authorized, there were only 2 docks in France that could hold these ships, and they were the number 1 and 2 docks at Toulon. But the 1912 program also authorized the extension of the Cherbourg, Brest, and Toulon docks, which would incorporate graving docks of no less than 250 meters in length, but those new docks would not be completed until 1917 at the latest. Work on the 1912 program progressed as planned, and in 1913, 4 Normandy-class battleships were laid down, and in early 1914, the 5th Normandy-class battleship was laid down. But by the end of 1914, the 1912 program would screech to a halt as World War I began. The shipbuilding industry nearly froze, as many of the shipyard workers were put into the French army and sent to the front lines. As for the battleships in the 1912 program, the Bretagnes were already launched and would be completed, being the only French battleships completed during the First World War. The Normandies, if they were close enough to being launched, would be completed, and their hulls were launched just to clear the slipways, but they would never be completed. As for the 4 Leon-class battleships, none of them were laid down, and the design was not even finalized. Now we'll skip forward to 1918, when World War I ended, and the 1912 naval program was dead. France had 4 incomplete battleship hulls floating in their waters, and another one still sitting on the slipways. Consideration was placed into completing the 5 Normandy-class battleships, but there was a serious issue with the designs of the ships that the French couldn't ignore from war experiences. The Normandy's hulls were designed directly off the Britannias, which of course were designed off the Corbett's, which were designed off pre-dreadnoughts. This meant that the Normandies inherited the same flawed protection system. The ships had good vertical armor, but no deck armor, and during the First World War, battle ranges were far greater than that of what France had expected when they made the 1912 program, nearly double and sometimes triple the distances that they expected. Plunging fire had suddenly become an extraordinary threat to all of France's battleships, and with newer and more modern fire control systems coming onto the playing field, firing at greater and greater ranges was becoming more and more manageable. Couple the protective flaws of the Normandies with the fact that France needed to place more manpower and resources into rebuilding mainland France, and the Normandies suddenly found themselves on the back burner, with the first 4 being ordered scrapped, and the 5th one, Béarn, which was still on the slipways, was ordered to be converted into an aircraft carrier, which would not be completed until 1927. With that, the 1912 building program was officially dead, and France would not commission another battleship until 1936, 2 decades after they had completed the last Britannia-class battleship. But the story of the 1936 battleship is a topic for another day. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.